Good morning. I am delighted to be here at my home congregation, even though I'm only virtually with you. It is just a joy to have the opportunity to connect with you. I'm wearing a stole that my sister made for me for my ordination, and I wanted to wear it at my first time of delivering a story and a homily from the virtual pulpit. 6 months ago, my first response to Russia's increasingly menacing saber rattling and the inevitable, to me, invasion of Ukraine was horror and distress. Shortly afterwards, I had to lead a service in Cumbria, UK, where I now live, and I felt the need of a story to help me find a way to think about the situation. A way to speak of the emotional anxiety and the horror of the news images and articles and photos. I looked in vain for suitable Russian and Ukrainian traditional tales, which were full of magic and Baba Yagas and witches. And in the end, I found that I had to come up with a story of my own. The story that I just told you was a way of letting my heart respond to the situation. At first, I saw the conflict in black and white. Russia was purely the unprovoked aggressor. Then I began to feel compassion for the ordinary enlisted or conscripted men fighting a war they did not understand or want, brother fighting brother, families torn apart and commanded to hate and destroy each other. And I began to understand Thich Nhat Hanh's words. When you begin to see your enemy is suffering, that is the beginning of insight. And I wove that into my story at the end, so it wouldn't be just a simple fairy tale with an ending of the destruction of the enemy and the heroes living happily ever after, though I hope they will. And I also wanted the ending to have hope in it and compassion. As I mentioned, I've only very recently been ordained. I'm a brand new ordinand. And the more I worked on the story that I've just told you, or let it work on me, the more it seemed to resonate with my gradually forming ordination vow. With love and compassion, I vow to serve life, to build bridges, to bring healing, and to honor the interconnected web of all creation. I began to see the invasion and the war as an imposed conflict conceived and initiated by those in power to suit their own agenda, not as something desired by the majority of the people on the Russian side, nor on the Ukrainian side, those people who would be fighting and dying and being uprooted from all the people and places and culture they had known and loved all their lives. I thought of other examples of imposed conflict or hatred which have occurred throughout history, such as Nazism, making Jews into the other, the enemy, the scapegoat, on whom all ills can be blamed, dehumanizing them. I thought of citizens being ordered to hate and destroy the people who were their friends, neighbors, children, business partners, husbands and wives. I thought of the Hutu and Tutsi in Rwanda being whipped up into a brutal and barbarous frenzy against each other, a bloodlust that could be satisfied only with mass killing, with genocide. I thought of the Civil War in the US. And closer to home, as I thought about being a white person growing up in apartheid South Africa, I thought about how a fear and distrust of anyone whose skin was a different shade was part of the atmosphere I absorbed, but not absorbed in my home, I hasten to stress, but all around me. I thought about how imposed conflict does not have to be physically violent to inflict untold destruction that is passed down from generation to generation, leaving a legacy of hatred, mistrust, and division. And I also realized how fear and greed makes those with precarious or with a very strong hold on power subjugate others. The minority fears the majority, or the majority feels invincible and does not feel that it has to account for its actions. 6 months into the Ukrainian conflict, our attention isn't what it once was. There's a powerful combination of factors which have caused this. The endless information and images at first, and that one can only absorb so much, and then that other stories take over the headlines. Life goes on. It's hard to sustain attention for prolonged conflict. Even some Ukrainians are going out to restaurants and ignoring air raid sirens. In general, mention of Ukraine is fading from the national and international news, certainly here in the UK, being replaced with celebrity trials, prime ministerial wannabes infighting climate change, and the natural catastrophe of heat, drought, and flood, the rise in the cost of living. All of these things taxing our already heavily taxed attention and taking it away from what is happening in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine seems to me to be increasingly viewed as something that is powerfully adversely affecting the economy, with a noticeable and extreme impact on our daily lives in terms of cost of living, rather than something that is impacting the lives of thousands, if not millions of people on the ground in Ukraine, and those hundreds of thousands of people who have fled the war-torn country. Maybe too much exposure in the early days of the invasion and war have blunted people's sense to the horrors that continue to unfold. Maybe people not in the conflict zone feel complacent that what's happening over there can never happen over here. As Mikhail Shishkin, novelist and winner of the Russian Booker, the Russian national bestseller, and the Big Book Prize, writes, "No one wants to hear about the war anymore. People are tired of horror. They want peace, not price rises, a quiet life, and a nice holiday." The only true lesson we can learn from history, he says, is that history teaches nothing. There are many news stories about how the initial outpouring of sympathy, empathy, welcome, and willingness to help Ukrainian refugees with food and shelter and money and creating new lives are beginning to fade, not out of not caring, but sometimes just from the sheer financial burden of doing so with the rise in the cost of living, which the war has largely created, forcing people to choose between supporting their own families and supporting strangers. Why does the conflict in Ukraine still matter? There's so many other horrors happening in the world all around us. Ukraine is just one example. To me, the most basic reason is the interconnected web of all beings. What affects the life of one of us affects us all. We're seeing this most dramatically in the unprecedented rise in the cost of living, especially fuel and basics such as electricity. But it also still really matters because we are in effect fighting a war by proxy. We're not just sending humanitarian aid in the form of food and medical supplies to Ukraine, but we're also sending lethal weapons to kill Russian soldiers and the inevitable so-called collateral damage of killing civilians on both sides with those weapons. Abraham Heschel, the great Jewish thinker and scholar, said, "Few are guilty, but all are responsible." And it matters because we share a great fear with all the rest of the world about how wide the conflict will spread and how devastating its effect might be on each and every one of us. As well as speaking of conflict, the hostilities and atrocity in Ukraine perpetrated by the Russians have led me to think about courage and the many forms it takes. The courage that manifests itself in times of conflict, it is the reverse side of the coin of war. In the Ukrainian context, it means putting your life on the line for your family to protect your homeland and the life and rights of others. It means participating in or leading peaceful protests, which might be answered with guns or tanks. Think of the images we all saw on the news of Ukrainian civilians walking peacefully towards Russian tanks. We've also seen Russian people protesting the invasion of Ukraine, at risk of attack and imprisonment by the authorities there. We've seen Ukrainian adults and children building homemade explosives and barricades to defend themselves. We've seen the courage of people staying to face the horrors, people somehow maintaining hope. And we have seen the courage to take each day, each moment as a gift, the courage to believe that right, not might, will prevail. And there's the courage of the women in war-torn countries and situations all over the world, particularly in the Ukraine, who, having the courage of love and desperation, are grabbing their own children and grandchildren and those of others who cannot flee the horrors of war. The courage of the women leaving the family life they knew with no certainty that it would ever be possible to have that again, knowing that they and they alone are responsible for keeping the children safe, for comforting and reassuring them and shielding them as best they can from the hardships and the horror, and the courage to lead them into a new life. And what about the heartbreaking courage of mothers who can't leave the war zone? What about the Russian women living in doubt, fear, and ignorance about what is happening to their sons and brothers and husbands? Let us praise their courage and pray for their safety and that of their children and families. And then there is the courage of responding to aggression with art. I've seen the art of Ukraine in an exhibition not too far from me, mostly by women artists, recording sights, creating images. There's one of a naked woman's torso smeared in blood, or perhaps it's red dye with a crown of thorns. I've seen 3 photos of a young girl, first in a birthday hat, then in her first communion white dress, and then the final images of her in a uniform with a rifle in her hands. And then there's a rear view of a couple in army fatigues holding hands, she with her wedding crown on her head. And all these images speak to me of the deep and intense love for their country that is expressed verbally and physically, and the decisions to stay till the end, whatever form that takes. Those of us who live beyond the actual theatre of war are blessed that we can turn away from the conflict. We do not have to live with the danger, horrors, and unpredictability of war every moment, every hour, every day of our lives. The people of Ukraine who have stayed by choice or necessity in the war zone do not have that choice. And all those who have fled Ukraine or who have loved ones in Ukraine or Russia cannot turn away from the conflict. Here in England, below the radar fighter planes are going out on maneuvers more often, shattering the quiet of the Lake Country and the farming community where I live. I am devoutly grateful that the only threat from those planes is to my eardrums and not to my life. Ukraine will prevail, says Dmytro Platenchuk, a Navy captain and public affairs officer in the destroyed city of Mykolaiv in Ukraine. Ukrainians have always resisted Russian imperialism. We have motivation, they don't. We are defending our homeland. They are fighting for a washing machine. My focus today has been on Ukraine, but I am also bearing very much in mind and heart that there are wars, horrors, hardships, man-made and natural, in so many countries around the world. May they all find peace and hope. I would like to leave you with these questions. Are we in some way complicit, whether actively or passively, in events in Ukraine? And if so, how does this apply to our attitude and actions regarding the conflict in Ukraine? Blessed be. Amen.